Hi, everybody. In this video, I would like to address a couple questions that are going to be vitally important for our understanding of Shakespeare and how to approach studying Shakespeare and understanding how a Shakespearean play or a Shakespearean text works. So that's what this is about, the Shakespearean text. And the four questions I want to address are these. What exactly is a Shakespeare play and where does it come from? Why are Shakespeare's plays available in so many different editions? And then what is an edition of a play? Does a Shakespeare film or stage performance have to be faithful to the original text? And how might we think about the relationship between printed text and performance of that text? So let's start with that first one. What exactly is a Shakespeare play? Now, when we're asked this, at first the answer seems pretty simple, and it is simple, right? Here, this is the text of a Shakespeare play, right? This is the PDF version of the Folger edition, which I provided you guys, and you very well might be using for your study. And there are lots of editions, right? I mean, in this class, uh, I've given you the recommendation of the Arden 3 Shakespeare, but my goodness, almost every major publishing house publishes some kind of complete works of Shakespeare or copies of the plays individually, and so on, right? So that's a Shakespeare play, right? Well, sure, this is a version of a Shakespeare play, okay? But of course, you already probably know, I mean, this is not actually Shakespeare's spelling, right? And this is obviously a modernized kind of text in terms of spelling and these line numbers and everything. And if you've seen multiple editions, you know that um, every edition or version of a Shakespeare play you look at kind of looks different, right? So we know there's an original there somewhere. So um, that's where we need to ask, where does this come from, right? And where does an edition come from? And the answer is, well, the original first printed versions of the play, right? Now, this is where things get very interesting because what we have for the original sources of Shakespeare's plays, the first major source we have is what's called the First Folio. That is a large volume of what were considered at that time the Shakespeare's complete plays, okay, published in 1623. And it was called a folio because folio refers to the size of the printed page used in the printing of the volume. So a folio volume, a folio book, was printed on pages that were essentially folded over once. They were doubled. And that produced a fairly large book. Think of something like a coffee table sized book that we might have nowadays, right? Very large page. Okay, and they were fairly expensive. That was the first sort of collected works of Shakespeare. He had been dead and in the ground 7 years at that point. His friends and fellow players put that together and published it as the comedies, histories, and tragedies of Shakespeare. About half of those plays were actually published before the first folio was published in a smaller, cheaper individual volumes called quartos. These were cheaper. These were cheaper. Quarto was made by folding that same sheet of paper, not just once, but several times over to turn it into or four different sheets. So you had a smaller book, a quarter of the size of the folio version, and they were not usually bound. They were sold just as paper copies, and they were much cheaper. Individual plays were published this way, about half of them before the folio was published. And in fact, they would have looked like this. This is actually an image of the 60 quarto edition of A Midsummer Night's Dream, first printed in 1600, which was about 5 years after it was first performed. Okay, so that's what it looked like, and I'll show you this in a few minutes, but it looks something like this. Okay, you can find these online if you poke around if you're interested. Now, that answers our first question. Where do they come from? Okay, the original plays were published in this kind of format, quartos first for half of them, and then in the big folio version. I'll show you an image of that in a second. Okay, those are the original sources. So whenever we have a modern edition, going back to our example Folger here, this gets to our second question, right? What is an edition of a play? An edition of a play is simply a copy, a version of the play that some editor, okay, and there are lots of different kinds of editors, has taken and has put together to publish for, a contemporary audience. So the person who did this Folger edition that you're reading, or any edition, modern edition of a Shakespeare play you're reading, they essentially, to put it simply, they went back and they looked at the original versions of the text. So they looked at, say, this quarto version, and then the folio version. This is Midsummer Night's Dream folio version. They looked at what they consider to be the most accurate authoritative texts available, the original ones, and then they construct an edition for their purposes and for their audience like this, okay? And they do things like regularize line numbers here, right? They clean up typos, they make the typeface look modern, they clarify sometimes stage directions. In many cases, they add act and scene numbers. Most of those were not original to Shakespeare, actually, but they were added by editors starting in the 18th century onward, really. Okay, so that's an edition. An edition is where an editor sits down with copies of usually the best or most authoritative original texts, as close to the original source as possible, and then they put it together and clean it up. Sometimes define words, with marginalia and so on, add line numbers and all sorts of stuff to make a nice, clean reading edition for a modern audience. Now, this also may answer that other part of the second question, why are there so many different editions? The short answer to that is because, well, every editor and every publishing company has a different purpose in mind. Um, some publishers, like Cambridge and Oxford, they want to make scholarly editions, by scholars, the most authoritative, clear texts possible. Some, like the Folger Shakespeare Library, wants a simplified, clean reading text like this one, which may not have a lot of words defined, and there are no footnotes and things like that. And it's made for students for easier reading and so on, without a lot of apparatus, right? Um, Now there's another layer here, though, and this is where it gets very interesting, and that is that unlike a very modern kind of book where, you know, the author submits a final manuscript to an editor, and the process is fairly straightforward, where the author and the editor finalize and agree upon the final copy to be printed or published. Things are messier in Shakespeare's time. The printing press had only been around at that point for 125 years or so. Um, and it was just messier. And we actually, when it comes to the case of Shakespeare, his plays often, not always, but in cases where there is not only a version from the folio, but there was also a quarto edition published maybe earlier, um, there might actually be slightly different versions of passages in the plays, and so on. Okay, and in fact, some scholars have argued that some plays, like King Lear, for example, or Hamlet, um, they actually exist in multiple versions that are so different from each other that they might actually represent like the same play but adapted for different audiences, or revised for a specific occasion, etc. So a number of Shakespearean plays actually exist in multiple original texts. And here I'm going to give you an example, and this will help explain why why in some cases there are multiple editions that might look a little different from each other. So I'm going to give you one example here. So here's a 1600 quarto edition of this play. And if you see here in our modern edition, right, we have Act 5, Scene 1. Hippolyta, after the entrance here, right, says, "'Tis strange thesis that these lovers speak of." Okay. And we see in the quarto edition, see it here. This is where this is taken from. Right, here's the stage direction, and here's the line. Hippolyta, "'Tis strange, my thesis, that the lovers speak of." Notice that there is no actual act or scene division here. The editor has done that for us. Okay. Notice we have Theseus, Hippolyta, and Philostrate show up here. Okay. Philostrate's the master of ceremonies. Okay. And we see later on here that Philostrate is the one in Act 5, Scene 1, who tells Theseus about the plays that are available to choose from, as you can see right here. And that's also true here in the quarto edition here. Here's Philostrate speaking, "Here, mighty Theseus," and here's the same passage I just showed you, right over here. Okay, that's Philostrate. Makes sense. He's the master of ceremonies. For Theseus, he was in the first scene of the play, and so on. But look at this version of Midsummer Night's Dream. This was the version published in the Folio 23 years later. Now you see here, this is the beginning of the same moment, right? Here's Hippolytus saying, "'Tis strange, my Theseus, these lovers speak of." You'll see it prints a little differently here, okay? The editor or the printers of the first folio, they included an act break. Actus Quintus is Act 5, but there's no scene number. So we see that's different. But there's also something different here that you might notice on closer inspection. Look who enters here. Theseus, Hippolyta, Aegeus and his lords. Not Philostrate, but Aegeus. And actually, if we look later in the scene, Theseus talks not to Philostrate, right over here on the right-hand side, right? But to Aegeus. Aegeus has the lines that Philostrate had, and so Hermia's father is actually the one on stage with Theseus at the end, speaking these lines. Now, what does this tell us? Well, first of all, it tells us that's kind of weird. We have two versions of the play, and there's good evidence to suggest that both of these versions of the play have authority, meaning, they're not forgeries or something. But we have two kind of different versions of this scene with completely different characters on stage. Now you might think, oh, that's not a big deal, like so what? But actually thinking about it a little bit more, this has some effects on the meaning. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the quarto version where we have Philostrate, and by the way, that's what you read, where Philostrate is the one doing the talking, we have like, all right, we don't even think of it, right? Master of ceremonies, here are the plays. It's very funny, how he's like deflecting from choosing that play. But we might notice that in this version, the version you read, and in the 1600 quarto edition, Aegeus, the father, is overruled by Theseus in the previous two scenes, and he disappears. He's gone. The father is gone. His will has been overruled. We don't see him again. And in fact, he may not even be part of like Hermia's life anymore. He's totally gone. Now think about how that might affect the meaning of the play, right? It's somewhat darker because the father-daughter might not have anything to do with each other anymore. He's just gone. But in the folio version, Aegeus shows up again in the final court scene. He's on stage. He's actually in the position now of helping select a play for the entertainments. And there's far more of a suggestion that there's some kind of reconciliation here because now Aegeus is part of the action. He's actually part of the festivities. So this is just one example of kind of two different versions, seemingly minor, of the same play. And both of them have equal claim to be authorial. They both have equal claim to be versions that Shakespeare approved of, quite possibly. Okay, so that is another layer on this second question we had here, which is um, which has everything to do with modern editions, and another reason for why there are many different editions is that editing Shakespeare can be a bit of a very interesting challenge because of this issue of there might be multiple versions, original versions of the play. Okay, and this leads us to our third question, which is, does a Shakespeare film or stage performance have to be faithful to the original text? The answer to that's quite complicated, I suppose, but what we can do to keep it simple is ask, what does faithful mean? Presumably it means that you have to, I guess, ethically speaking, act out and perform the whole text as we have it. But there are two complications with that. Number one, as we've already seen, with at least half the plays, there's more than one original text. And it might vary very minorly in terms of just some words are different here and there, or it might vary enough that it might actually constitute a different version of the play. Okay, and that leads us to the second part of this question, which is, without going into the details of it, it seems pretty clear that Shakespeare's plays, even in his own time, were adapted, cut, rewritten in parts, shortened, expanded, and revised in his own lifetime, quite possibly, and quite possibly by him. There's a lot of evidence for this we've uncovered in recent decades in the scholarship that actually suggests that this is one of the reasons why there are some significant differences in some of the original versions, the original printings of Shakespeare's plays. And if that's true, which there's really good evidence to suggest that it is, that means that even in Shakespeare's time, he felt apparently, if the evidence is true and the conclusion is accurate, that it was perfectly fine to adapt, rearrange, revise, edit, rewrite bits of the plays over time, to change them to suit a different audience, to expand them because they were going to play a longer evening, or to shorten them because they only had 90 minutes to do a play as opposed to 3 hours. So there's really good evidence for that, which means that this question is actually a very difficult one, because what would it mean to be faithful to the original text if Shakespeare himself, there's that good evidence for, felt free to adapt and revise and change plays to suit the occasion and to suit the audience. Okay, so what I will say for this before moving on to the last question and concluding is, I think what's important is that two things. First of all, no, a Shakespearean director or actors or troupe like the Royal Shakespeare Company, um, they they feel free to, and they have good reason to feel free to adapt plays, cut them, rearrange them, sometimes even add bits, modernize them, and do all sorts of interesting things to them, because that's actually part of what's been done to Shakespeare's plays since the beginning, right? So being faithful to an original text, um, in that sense, is not something that even Shakespeare himself necessarily thought it appropriate to do with his own works, because he wrote for the theater. The theater is a living, breathing, deeply socially contextualized form of art. So it makes sense that he revised and cut quite possibly, and that his plays sometimes existed in multiple different versions depending on what occasion they were being performed for and so on. Okay, and certainly since Shakespeare's plays were performed later after he was dead, we know that directors and then later actors felt quite liberated to adapt, tweak them, and rearrange them to make them live for their own audiences, to keep them alive as performance art. So that's the first part of that question. The second part is, um, it is important, I think, for an educated viewer of Shakespeare to understand this issue, and to understand that, yes, you will actually have performances of Shakespeare that line up with the original script as we have it, or even as we have them, to a greater or lesser degree. So I guess what I'm saying is, um, it's okay to adapt and perform Shakespeare like however an actor or acting troupe or director or filmmaker wants to do. Absolutely. Shakespeare very likely wouldn't even object to it, given his own very likely practices in his own lifetime, right? But it is important to know that, of course, you can have a version, a film version of a Shakespeare play that is, very close to the original text or texts as we have them, versus one that is, really not paying that much attention to, the niceties of the particular text, and maybe, offering a very, very heavily adapted and cut up version of the play that's not necessarily as faithful to the original text. And that's okay, in my humble opinion, as long as we recognize that there are actually original texts behind them. We can go to them, we can check them and see how close or distant a particular performance is from the text, and just be aware of that. We don't necessarily have to judge it automatically as unfaithful or bad, but it's just good to be aware of the fact that, hey, I'm watching this version of Hamlet, and it's not sticking very carefully to the original two main versions that we have published, right? That's okay, but it's just good to recognize that a play or a performance can be not necessarily sticking to the original printed version slavishly, but still be doing something very cool, very interesting, and that may actually help us understand the play in a new way. And that leads us to this last question, which I won't take too long with, and that is, it is a very rich dynamic interplay between the original printed script that we have and performances of that script. Okay, um, actors, directors, people in the performance industry who are performing a text, they have to go with the text, right? They have to start with the text because, like, what else are you going to start with? You have to start with the text. And that text obviously is the foundation of the performance. It is the ultimate source of the performance because, like, those are Shakespeare's words, right? Um, However, they can adapt it and perform it, and very often those performances become part of the life of that play. And without getting too far in the weeds here, what I'll say is that often directors and actors, when they're putting together a performance of a text, they're actually very often aware of previous famous performances of the text or films of the text. And sometimes those previous performances color the choices they make with their version. Sometimes the director might be very consciously responding to some other director's version of a play, right, or some other famous performance of the play. So in that case, a performance may actually influence another performance, but the text of this play is still underneath all of that. Okay, and there are occasions, which we might get into later in the semester, where particular editions of a text might be affected by some of the performance history of that play, for instance. So there is a dynamic interplay between the original script of the text, which is the source and foundation of any Shakespeare performance. It obviously shapes the performance, but then performers adapt and cut and revise and make that text live in their own interpretive way on stage or on film. And that becomes part of the play's performance history. And sometimes that performance history can affect other performances of that play, and sometimes even work their way into textual editions of the play, um, just as part of the history of that play. And all of that can help illuminate a Shakespearean play, help us understand a Shakespearean play, help us see a play in a brand new light that we've never thought of before, and so on. All of which I would argue is vital and beautiful and lovely, um, and a great way to keep Shakespeare alive and to understand how these texts continue to speak to us today, on the page and on the stage. I hope this makes sense. I hope you sort of learn to appreciate the significance of some of what I've said here, just because I think it's really cool. And it actually is stuff, when you're reading a Shakespeare play, whether you're aware of it or not, there's a lot that's going into these words that are sitting in front of you. And I hope this video has helped you kind of understand a little bit of that, and also understand the ways in which text and performance can work together and even sometimes shape each other.